January 7th, 1945. The Ardennes forest is buried under 3 feet of snow, but inside the British press tent, the atmosphere is electric. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stands before a cluster of microphones. The cameras flash, illuminating his sharp, hawk-like features. He is smiling. Not a weary smile of a commander who has just survived the bloodiest battle of the war, but the arrogant smirk of a man who believes he is the smartest person in the room. He tells the reporters that the Battle of the Bulge was one of the most tricky he had ever handled. He speaks of the American troops not as allies, but as children he had to rescue. He uses the word "I" over and over again. I employed the whole available power. I put it into the fight with a bang. To the journalists scribbling furiously, it sounds like a hero's speech. But 300 meters away at the Supreme Allied Headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower is not smiling. He is holding a transcript of the speech, and his hands are shaking with a rare, cold fury. For 3 years, Eisenhower has played the peacemaker. He has tolerated the insults. He has swallowed his pride. But today, the patience has run out. Montgomery thinks he is untouchable. He does not realize that he has just signed his own professional death warrant. The pen is already moving across the paper. To understand why this press conference was a suicide note, we must look at the toxic marriage between the British and American commands. It was an alliance built on necessity, not friendship. On one side was Dwight Eisenhower, Ike, a man of consensus, a politician in uniform whose genius lay in keeping a massive coalition from tearing itself apart. He viewed the war as a team sport. On the other side was Montgomery. Monty, a hero of El Alamein, brilliant, methodical, and suffering from a narcissism so profound it baffled those around him. Monty did not view the war as a team sport. He viewed it as a solo performance where he was the star and the Americans were the supporting cast. He openly considered Eisenhower to be a strategic amateur, a nice chap who should stick to logistics and let the real soldiers handle the fighting. For months leading up to 1945, the tension had been simmering. Monty demanded total command of all ground forces, effectively asking Eisenhower to demote himself. Washington hated Monty. Churchill constantly had to intervene to save him. But Eisenhower had always protected him, believing that Monty's tactical skill was worth the headache. The Americans provided the steel. The British provided the experience. That was the deal. But as the winter of 1944 set in, the balance of power had shifted. The student had become the master, and the master refused to accept it. And then came the snow. In the frozen weeks of December, inside his mobile tactical trailer, Montgomery lived in a reality of his own creation. He truly believed he was the only man capable of saving the alliance. He looked at the maps of the Western Front and saw American incompetence everywhere. He saw General Omar Bradley's forces spread too thin. He saw Patton's aggression as reckless gambling. In Monty's mind, the chaos of the war was a direct result of Eisenhower's broad front strategy. He sat with his cup of tea, surrounded by portraits of enemy generals he had defeated, convinced that destiny was calling him to take charge. He wrote letters to his superiors in London, claiming that the Americans were useless without his guidance. He wasn't doing this out of malice. He was doing it out of a supreme, blinding conviction that he was right. He believed he was indispensable. He thought the Americans needed him so badly that they would tolerate any insult, any demand just to keep him on the field. He assumed Eisenhower was too weak, too political to ever fire him. was a belief born of hubris. He forgot that even the greatest general is ultimately just a soldier, and every soldier answers to someone. He did not see the knife hanging over his head. The crisis that triggered the explosion began on December 16, 1944. The Germans launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. The attack smashed into the American lines, creating a deep wedge that physically separated General Omar Bradley's headquarters in the south from his two massive armies, the 1st and the 9th in the north. Communications were cut. Chaos reigned. Eisenhower made a difficult, pragmatic decision. He looked at the map and saw that Bradley could not command the troops in the north. Swallowing his pride, Eisenhower ordered the temporary transfer of these 200,000 American soldiers to Montgomery's command. It was a purely military move to ensure unity of command during a crisis. For Omar Bradley, this was a humiliation. Giving up his men to his British rival felt like a demotion. For George Patton, it was treason. The American generals were furious, but they obeyed. They expected Montgomery to act as a caretaker, a temporary steward who would respect the American chain of command. They expected professionalism. Instead, they got a lecture. Montgomery did not arrive at the American headquarters quietly. He swept in like a feudal lord visiting a peasant village. He strode into the operations room of the U.S. First Army, refusing to look the exhausted American officers in the eye. He immediately rejected their defensive plans. He reorganized their lines. He stopped their counterattacks. He spoke to seasoned American generals as if they were cadets who had failed their first exam. "I shall tidy up this mess," he reportedly said, a phrase that burned into the souls of the American staff. He refused to travel to meet Bradley, forcing the American commander to come to him. When they met, Monty was patronizing, lecturing Bradley on basic tactics, while the American general ground his teeth in silence. The atmosphere in the Allied camp turned poisonous. American officers began to openly discuss whether they would rather fight the Germans or the British. But Monty was oblivious. He mistook their silence for agreement. He mistook their discipline for submission. He successfully stabilized the Northern Front. That is undeniable. But in doing so, he destroyed the last shreds of goodwill he had with his allies. He was winning the battle on the map, but losing the war in the headquarters. And then he decided to brag about it. The press conference of January 7th was the spark that blew up the powder keg. The data from the transcripts is damning. Montgomery stood before the world and presented a version of the Battle of the Bulge that bordered on fiction. He described the battle as one of the most interesting and tricky he had ever handled, trivializing the desperate struggle where 19,000 Americans died. He barely mentioned the heroic defense of Bastogne by the U.S. 101st Airborne. He ignored Patton's grueling drive from the south. Instead, he painted a picture where the Americans were crumbling until he, the British master, stepped in to save them. The British press, hungry for a victory, ate it up. The headlines in London screamed, "Monty saves the Yanks." When the news reached General Bradley, he told Eisenhower he would resign rather than serve under Montgomery again. Patton demanded to be let loose. The entire U.S. command structure was in revolt. They had bled for every inch of snow in the Ardennes, and now this man was claiming their sacrifice as his personal tactical exercise. The illusion of a united alliance shattered. Eisenhower realized he could no longer compromise. The scene in Eisenhower's office was quiet. There was no shouting, No throwing of objects, just the scratching of a pen. Eisenhower sat at his desk, his face set in stone. He was done with the politics. He was done with the appeasement. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began to draft a cable to General George Marshall in Washington. The words he wrote were cold, precise, and final. He detailed the breakdown of trust. He explained that the current command structure had become unworkable. And then he wrote the ultimatum that would change history. He stated clearly that if Montgomery's attitude did not change, or if he was not removed, Eisenhower would resign. The equation was simple. It was him or me. This was not a bluff. Eisenhower was offering the combined chiefs of staff a choice between the supreme commander of all Allied forces or a difficult field marshal. He showed the draft to Montgomery's chief of staff, Freddie de Guingant. When de Guingant read the words, the blood drained from his face. He looked at the paper, then at Eisenhower, and realized the terrifying truth. Eisenhower wasn't asking for an apology. He was preparing to fire the most famous general in the British Empire. The order was ready to be sent. Freddie de Guingant rushed out of the office and drove through a blizzard to reach Montgomery's tactical headquarters. When he arrived, Monty was as cheerful as ever, completely unaware of the storm he had created. De Guingant didn't waste time. He slammed his hand on the table and told Monty to stop talking. "Ike is going to fire you," de Guingant said, "and he has the full support of Washington and London." For a moment, Monty laughed. He couldn't believe it. "Ike wouldn't do that," he said. "He needs me." De Guingant shook his head and described the letter. He described the look in Eisenhower's eyes. He told Monty that even Winston Churchill could not save him this time. The reality hit Montgomery like a physical blow. The smirk vanished. He slumped into his chair, looking suddenly small and old. For the first time in the war, the great field marshal was terrified. He realized he had miscalculated everything. He wasn't dealing with a weak politician. He was dealing with the most powerful man in the Western world, and he had pushed him one step too far. The silence in the trailer was absolute. The indispensable man was about to be discarded. Why did it come to this? The conflict wasn't just about egos. It was about the shifting tectonic plates of the war. In 1942, Britain was the senior partner, providing the experience and the basis. But by 1945, the United States was providing 80% of the men, 90% of the equipment, and almost all the oil. Montgomery was fighting a 1942 war in a 1945 reality. He failed to understand that the Supreme Command was a political entity as much as a military one. Eisenhower's job was to keep the alliance together. By humiliating the U.S. Army publicly, Monty didn't just insult soldiers. He threatened the political stability of the coalition. He forced Eisenhower to choose between his own army and his British ally. And when forced to choose, Eisenhower chose his own men. It was a failure of emotional intelligence. Monty treated war as a game of chess, where only the moves mattered. Eisenhower treated war as a human endeavor, where morale and trust were the ammunition. Monty could move the pieces, but he had forgotten that he didn't own the board, and the board was about to be flipped. The next morning, a letter arrived on Eisenhower's desk. It was written in Montgomery's hand. It was not arrogant. It was not demanding. It was a total, unconditional surrender. "Dear Ike," it read, "I am distressed that my note may have upset you. I am your very devoted subordinate." He promised to do whatever was required. He signed it. "Your very devoted servant, Monty." It was the most humiliating moment of Montgomery's life. He had to beg for his job. Eisenhower read the letter. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded, took the firing order he had drafted, and placed it in his secret file. He sent a reply accepting the apology, but the tone was cool, professional, and distant. The crisis was averted. The press was told that all was well. The alliance held, but the friendship was dead. Eisenhower never trusted Montgomery again. The relationship became purely functional. From that day forward, Eisenhower leaned more heavily on Omar Bradley, giving the Americans the lead in the final race into Germany. When the Rhine crossing came, Eisenhower let the Americans take the glory, leaving Monty to stage his own elaborate crossing that mattered little to the strategic outcome. The "shut up or get out" moment also cemented American dominance in the post-war world. It was the moment the baton passed definitively from the British Empire to the United States. Churchill knew it. He privately told his staff that Monty had nearly wrecked everything. In the history books, they stood side by side on Victory Day. But in the private corridors of power, Montgomery was isolated. He had won his battles, but he had lost the respect of the men who mattered. He remained a hero to the British public, but to the Allied High Command, he was a liability that had been neutralized. He kept his stars, but he lost his voice. History often remembers the Battle of the Bulge for the tanks and the snow. But the most dangerous battle was fought with a pen in a warm office. Eisenhower's victory over Montgomery was not a tactical one. It was a victory of character over ego. It reminds us that in the high-stakes world of global warfare, brilliance is not enough. You can be a tactical genius. You can be a national hero. But if you cannot respect the men bleeding beside you, you are useless. Montgomery thought he was bigger than the war. Eisenhower showed him that no man is bigger than the mission. That day, the alliance was saved not by a cannon, but by an ultimatum.